Marina Silva smoothed her red vest one more time before stepping into the elegant dining room of the Riverside Hotel. At 26, she had worked as a server for 3 years, taking shifts between her graduate studies in speech-language pathology. But today felt different somehow, heavier with anticipation she couldn't quite name. The restaurant manager had briefed the staff that morning about Table 12, a private celebration for the Westfield family, specifically for William Westfield, the tech billionaire, and his father, Edward, who was visiting from across the country. The instructions were simple: impeccable service, absolute discretion, and special attention to the elderly gentleman. What the manager hadn't mentioned, what Marina discovered when she approached the table, was that Edward Westfield was deaf. She noticed it in the way his son William leaned close to speak to him, and how Edward's eyes focused intently on lips rather than making casual eye contact, in the slight confusion that crossed his weathered face when the other server had tried to take his order earlier. Marina watched from across the room as Edward sat somewhat apart from the conversation flowing around him, his blue suit impeccable, his silver hair perfectly styled, but his expression carrying that particular loneliness of someone who exists in a room full of people yet remains fundamentally apart from them. She had seen that expression before. Her younger brother had been born deaf, and she'd grown up watching him navigate a world that rarely made space for him. She'd learned sign language as naturally as spoken English, never thinking of it as special until she was older and realized most people never bothered to learn how to communicate with those who couldn't hear. Marina approached the table where William, perhaps 31 and wearing an expensive navy suit, was reviewing the wine list. Edward sat beside him, hands folded, waiting patiently for someone to tell him what would happen next. "Good evening," Marina said, making sure she stood where Edward could see her face. Then, carefully and clearly, she began to sign as she spoke. "My name is Marina, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. It's an honor to serve you." Edward's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been politely distant, suddenly focused on Marina with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stared at her hands, at her face, and then his own hands began to move. "You know sign language?" He signed, his movements sharp with surprise and something that looked like hope. "Yes, sir." Marina signed back, her spoken words trailing naturally behind her hands. "I grew up signing with my brother. If you like, I can take your order directly, and I'm happy to interpret anything you need throughout the evening." William had put down the wine list and was staring at Marina with an expression of shock. "You can communicate with my father?" "If he'd like me to, yes," Marina said gently. What happened next was something Marina would remember for the rest of her life. Edward's face, which had been politely composed, crumbled. His hands came up to cover his mouth, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. His shoulders shook with emotion he'd clearly been holding back for far too long. William reached for his father immediately, concern and confusion mixing on his face. "Dad, what's wrong? Did she upset you?" Edward shook his head vigorously, his hands moving in signs his son couldn't understand. Marina found tears in her own eyes as she watched this elderly man, this father who had probably spent decades feeling invisible in his own son's world, finally being seen. "He's not upset," Marina said softly to William. "He's saying he hasn't had someone speak directly to him in sign language in over 2 years. Not since his wife passed away." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. She was the only one who learned to sign fluently. Everyone else in his life speaks at him through interpreters or written notes, but no one speaks to him. Not directly. Not as a person who deserves to be addressed rather than talked about. William's face had gone pale. He looked at his father, really looked at him, and seemed to see something he'd been missing. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought the interpreter services I hired, the tablets with text-to-speech programs, I thought that was enough." "It's functional," Marina said gently, But it's not the same as someone taking the time to learn your language, to speak to you in the way that feels most natural to you. Edward had composed himself somewhat, though tears still tracked down his face. His hands moved in careful, deliberate signs, and Marina translated for William. He says you think you're accommodating him. But accommodation without connection is just another form of isolation. He says he knows you're busy, that you built an empire, and he's proud of you. But he misses having conversations. Real conversations, where someone looks him in the eyes and speaks his language instead of treating it as a barrier to overcome. William sank into his chair, his hand over his mouth. God, Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I've been making you feel invisible. Marina translated, and Edward signed back, his movements gentle now, forgiving. He says he knows you love him. Marina interpreted. He sees it in the care you take to include him, and how you always make sure he has the best specialists, the finest accommodations. But love isn't just about providing things. It's about presence. It's about being willing to meet someone in their world, instead of always asking them to adapt to yours. The entire restaurant had gone quiet around them. Other diners had noticed the emotional scene, and even the typically discreet staff had paused to watch. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. William stood and moved to kneel beside his father's chair. "Teach me," he said, looking up at Edward with raw emotion on his face. "I know I should have learned years ago. I know I've been making excuses about time and work and everything else. But teach me, Dad. Please. I want to talk to you. Really talk to you." Edward placed a weathered hand on his son's cheek, and then he began to sign. His movements were slow, careful, teaching his son to sign for love, for family, for time, for sorry, for beginning. Marina watched as William mimicked the signs, his expensive suit wrinkling as he knelt on the restaurant floor, learning his first words in his father's language. And she translated when needed. But mostly she just stood witness to this moment of reconnection, of a bridge being built between two people who loved each other, but had somehow lost the ability to truly communicate. Edward turned to Marina, his face still wet with tears but transformed by joy. His hands moved in signs that needed no translation, but she spoke them anyway for the room to hear. "Thank you for seeing me," Marina interpreted. "Thank you for reminding my son that I'm still here, still someone worth talking to. You are always worth it." Marina signed back. Some of us just needed to remember that the effort of learning someone else's language is how we prove they matter. William and Edward stayed for 3 hours that evening. Their dinner grew cold as William filled pages in a notebook with signs Marina taught him, practicing over and over until his hands began to move with something approaching fluency. Other diners approached their table before leaving, asking Marina to teach them basic signs, inspired by what they'd witnessed.